Okay, class, we now are talking on burns. Burns can be caused by many things: heat, electricity, radiation, certain chemicals. What happens is you have tissue damage, denatured proteins. Remember, proteins will bend out of shape, cell death. Immediate threat is dehydration, imbalance, and so forth. We'll talk about it. Okay. How do you classify the severity of burns? One is extent of body surface. One of these is called the rule of nines, but there are other classification systems also that look at that. In the rule of nines, you basically have broken everything up into 9% or half a 9, 4.5%. So other words like the legs, 9% right there, 9%, okay? Anterior and posterior, okay? So everything is broken up into this percentage, and based upon this percentage, you would get an idea of what the extent, the surface area covered. Now that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it, we'll go over here, is to look at it from the standpoint, let's get this bigger, of the depth of injury. When you look at it at the depth of injury, we have the superficial. The superficial would only involve the epidermis. Okay, then we have what we call the partial thickness. The partial thickness would involve the epidermis and into the dermis. Now remember, the skin includes the epidermis and the dermis. So this goes into the dermis, but not all the way through. Into the dermis, but not all the way through. That's called a partial thickness because it's not going all the way through. Okay. A full thickness goes all the way through. So what they've classified here is superficial partial thickness, okay, which means it's going into the dermis, but not all. Then a deep partial thickness, which means it's going almost to the full extent of the dermis. Then a true full thickness, which goes all the way through the skin, and then a fourth degree, which extends even all the way to bone and so forth like that. So right here is a picture to show you superficial first degree, like a sunburn, partial thickness second degree, that goes into the dermis but not all the way through, and a third degree would go all the way through, and so it would be the entire integumentary going through, and then a fourth degree, which you don't see, would go all the way down. So here's another classification: first degree, second, okay, second degree, second, third degree, full thickness through the layers of the skin, and then fourth degree. Okay. So this kind of shows you the classification based upon depth. Okay. So partial thickness, first degree epidermis only, redness, swelling. Second degree epidermis and upper dermal damage. Okay, type of thing there. Right? See, here's a first degree and here's a second degree, which means partial thickness. Okay. Here's a third degree. That's all the way through. They mention no initial edema or pain because you've actually burned out the nerve endings. Now, think about it. If it's no pain where you burned out the nerve endings, but if you burned out a section of skin, then around that area got hot. It just didn't get hot enough to burn. So you may have pain around the site for full thickness burn, but right in the site you won't because you burned the nerves out. Okay. So here would be kind of a picture of this third degree type of burn there. And then the fourth degree, as I alluded to, goes all the way, could go down to the bone, really. Okay. So the severity of burns depends on 25% of second degree, 10% of third degree. So now this combines both the surface area and the depth. The surface area, you see, 25% second degree. Okay, that's a pretty severe. 10% of third degree because you're going all the way down. The other thing, if you burn your face, hands, or feet, because then that's going to be quite a problem right there. Or the other, if you burn a flexural area. Now let's think about this. If you burn in the inner arm, at the elbow area, inner arm, okay. If you burn there or behind the kneecap, okay, which we call the popliteal fossa, okay. So if you burn into that area there, then you could get contractures where the skin heals and you can't release it. Where the skin heals and you can't release it there, in those fossas there, okay. All right. So we'll go further then. So how do you treat severe burns? One of the major and first things is a significant fluid and electrolyte loss, because you've covered, see, remember that keratinized stratified squamous is gone. So sometimes you have to give IV fluids with severe burns. Infections, well, you always do, to be honest. They stick an IV in you. Infection, antibiotics, generally IV, sometimes topical. Scarring, you have to debride and take off the scar tissue. To heal back, you need a lot of nutritional support, above the calories that you normally would, and then, of course, pain management. So this is kind of what you see when we're dealing with the burn aspect there. All right. So now we go to, let's say, wound healing. Wound healing. Okay. Let's go back to our Histo 2 here. I'll put that over here. Okay, so you got a cut. We talked about in chapter 4. You got a cut. Inflammation occurred to kind of clean off the perimeter. First thing that happened was bleeding coming in, and bleeding cleansed the wound. As long as you don't bleed too much, is good. Then the top would dry. You'd get a scab because the top would dry. So now you got this blood clot up in here and the scab. Inflammation, because the mast cells would start to produce histamine and heparin to kind of clean off the perimeter there. The blood clot would also give what we call fibrin, so that migration could occur of cells to come in and repair. So let's go further. This is what you had in chapter 4. Migration, white blood cells going to the area to clean it. Parenchymal, remember the most important, that would be the fibroblasts would come in. Macrophages try to clean it up. What do we have here? You got to get new blood vessels. That was granulation tissue. You got to get new, the area has to revascularize. Okay. Then the migration would attempt, the fibroblasts would try to heal the dermis, and the stratum basale cells, now that you know what they are, would try to heal the epidermis. So they would move over. Okay, maturation. And then what will have, the scab detaches. Now, sometimes you may get some scarring. Fibrosis is a fancy name for scarring. So now we come back over here. So here's some skin healing issues. A hematoma is a pocket of blood. A hematoma is a pocket of blood. A seroma sometimes, in other words, when this heals, you may get a pocket of blood down here, and it doesn't heal completely because a seroma is a fluid pocket. Fibrosis is a fancy name for scarring. Now, you have two kinds of scars that can occur. Now, first of all, a scar is when you put connective tissue where something else should be. A scar is when you put connective tissue, collagen, where something else should be. Now, the scar, it would be at the surface. So instead of putting the epidermis here, that dermis comes up and beats the epidermis closure. That dermis comes up. So a hypertrophic scar is like a scar that's not that bad. It's just, some people just have a hypertrophic. little scar. It stays in the wound edge, doesn't really raise up over the wound edge or nothing. Just a scar, but you can tell that there's a scar there because when you look at it, you can see it's different than the surrounding skin. A keloid is a terrible scar. Some people, the scar will raise up high, go over the edge and everything. So that's what we call a keloid. So we have the hypertrophic scar and we have the keloid. The hypertrophic is just hypertrophic scar could be even with the rest of the skin, but you can tell that it's a slight scar there. Now you can't scar unless you do a deep wound. Let me say that again. A deep wound means you cut into the dermis. A deep wound means you come into the dermis. If you only have just the epidermis bothered, that's what we call a superficial injury. Superficial. So the epidermis is a superficial injury, but a deep injury is when you go into the dermis. So then we have a superficial and we have the deep. Superficial and then we have the deep. Okay? Superficial and then we have the deep. So the deep means you cut into the dermis. If you just have the superficial, you can't scar because you're not revealing any of the connective tissue. Now, how do you know that you got a deep cut? If you see any bleeding. The epidermis is totally avascular. So if you see one drop of blood, you did cut into the dermis. If you see one drop of blood, you did cut into the dermis. Because you can't get bleeding from a superficial. Now you can get, so you didn't see bleeding, it heals, and you say, well, I see a difference in my skin. That's a color change. Because if you cut yourself, you also would have removed some of the melanocytes. So you may see a discoloration, but that's not a scar. You may see a discoloration because if it only involved the epidermis, you can't get scarring because scarring is where you put connective tissue where something else should have been. Okay? So that's how it would occur. All right? Now, here, I'm not going to really get into it. It's something you may want. I talk about here wound closure when we're in surgery. Primary, secondary, and tertiary closures. This is something that you can look at and be around to look at when you get into your nursing and so forth. You want to use this. I also bring in the type of suture materials, the absorbable and non-absorbable. The absorbable ones we would use inside you because we suture you in layers, so we're not going to go inside and cut the sutures out and so forth. So I bring that up. Here are different, we talk more about the sutures and so forth. The types of sutures that something to kind of glance at. But again, I'm not going to test you on this because, but it's to show how we close things in surgery. If we're closing bone, we use steel because bone will never heal back to where we could let the sutures break. It'll pop back open. So like when we're doing cardiac surgery, we split the breastbone, the sternum, and then we use an interrupted wire type of thing to close with. And so you'll see that. And then here's removal and so forth. So anyway, this was just something I added in. But again, nothing I'm going to test you on, but something that some of you may get interested in. Just kind of glance at that. So with that, I am going to close this. I'm not going to talk about development. We already know that the epidermis comes from ectoderm, so I'm not going to get into that. Okay. And we'll just we'll close right here.